Good evening, everyone. We're at the height of an exciting campaign season, and at the Strand, we want to make some news this evening with a ringing endorsement. We continue to support important and compelling books. I'm Nancy Bass-White, and I'm the third generation of Strand owners, along with my dad, who's in the back. It's Fred Bass. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded by my grandfather in 1927 in an area that was located around the corner that's no longer in existence. It was called Book Row. And after 80 years, we just want to thank our customers for the support. Along with my husband, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, I'm a loyal Democrat. Both of us think Senator Clinton and Senator Obama would make an excellent president who would get America back on track. So we're neutral in the Democratic primary for president. But here at the Strand, we aren't neutral about exceptional books and creative people, and tonight in Mark Penn, we have both. Mark is one of the most influential political experts in the United States. He's the premier strategist for Senator Clinton's presidential run, the CEO of the worldwide public relations firm, Burson Marsteller, and he's also been advisor to many, including our own Mayor Bloomberg and Bill Gates, and he's now the author of the recent book, Micro Trends, the Small Forces Beyond Tomorrow's Big Changes. As much as everybody probably only wants to speak about presidential politics, we've asked Mark to discuss micro trends tonight. He writes about how small numbers of people drive business markets or other cultural, social, and political developments. He identifies 75 micro trends that can transform a business, tie an election, spark a movement, or change your life. As usual, after Mark's done, there'll be plenty of times to open up this mic to any of your questions. So tonight, let's have Clinton and Obama supporters and everyone else shout a big welcome for Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate your having me here tonight. I know we set this up a few months ago, and I was determined to take an hour off, and which I haven't done for a while, and talk about the book. For those of you who were expecting a political book, it's not a political book. It's really a book about trends in America. It doesn't have any campaign secrets. When people try to kind of read into it one thing or another, the truth of the matter is it is a book about how the country's changing and how you see some of the trends that are quite important to those changes. You know, the theory of the book is that the era of big trends is over, and that, you know, we're now in an era of what I call micro trends. And it's not to say that, in fact, the era of big movements is over, or big changes are over, or that big things that happen are over. All of those things, I think, are quite strong. In fact, the book, as I come back to, ends, I think, quite optimistically about how it seems to me that we're coming together around a common set of values, even though we are, in many ways, so much more individualistic. And I think that what we're finding is that there are a tremendous number of 1% trends that are driving society, that small groups are, in fact, becoming pivotally important. I think even if you look in the presidential campaign, a group like YouTubers, for example, is never going to be a large group, but it played an influential role in one of the key presidential debates. It plays an influential role in a lot of the changes in society. And so what we're seeing with these microtrends is that they don't have to become big to become important, to become integrated into our culture. You know, we seem to be, you know, as I look at it, there were 2 or 3 things going on. First, obviously, you know, the internet has made it so much easier to reach so many more people in so many different ways, and to bring together communities, you know, across their geography. I think that's that's pretty straightforward. I think second is that the economy itself has changed from what I call a Ford economy to a Starbucks economy. In the Ford economy, you could have, as you may recall, as they said about the Model T, you could have any color you want as long as it's black. And today at Starbucks, it's mocha, frappuccino, decaf, semi, grande, 180. There are actually 155 separate choices because the economy has changed from the idea of mass production being uniform production to the idea that in fact we can give people the kind of choices in their lives that mean something to them, even on something as small as coffee. I always say the iPod is an example of a cross between the Ford economy and the Starbucks economy, because for a long time it was any color you want as long as it was white. And what it did was it drove the personalization to the music so that you could actually walk around with something that was infinitely personalized, even though it was commonly manufactured. And that is very much the key to how the economy is changing, in that people want things to be infinitely personalized. I think that it's quite interesting. I think in addition to that, there's an individualistic streak. You know, people today don't wear the same color clothes. They don't want to look alike. As you go back to the 50s, if your neighbor had a house with a white picket fence, you would say, we want a white picket fence. Today, I think if your neighbor has a white picket fence, you probably turn around and say, let's have a purple fence. People actually have become more individualistic. And so I think what's happened is the changes with the internet, the changes with the economy and what can be produced, along with, I think, a more individualistic streak, is really producing micro trends, which are producing some very interesting and almost contradictory things. I think there's while on the other hand the economy in many ways is struggling, there certainly is considerably more affluence. And yet people, as we talk about in the book, want to work more and more even when they are affluent. You're having the sense that there's a tremendous trend towards health, and yet at the same time people are heavier and more obese than ever. People are drinking water at a faster and faster rate. Growth of water consumption was close to 25% a year, but the fastest growing beverage are drinks like Monster, loaded with caffeine. So you have time and time again contradictory trends. Society has never been more technologically oriented, and yet, on the same hand, religion has never seen the kind of growth that religion is seeing. Just as you see technology, today you see quiet cars on the train. So for almost every trend, there's a counter trend. And so how do you explain that society isn't changing in a single direction, it is changing in so many contradictory and different ways? Well, that's what microtrends is about. Microtrends is that there are people making individual choices important to them that in many ways change their life. And once you have kind of the theory of that, then most of the book really goes through the practice. Now, we start out, with sex and romance in the first couple of chapters, primarily because we wanted to sell some books. And in the first chapter, we really talk about what we call sex ratio singles. And we did something that I don't think anyone has done, a simple calculation that we took from studies in terms of what is the straight sex ratio and what impact does that have. Well, it turns out in this country slightly more boys than girls are born. Then when you get to high school, what happens is far more boys either die in car accidents, shootings, or wind up in jail than women. So there starts to be an imbalance. And in the studies in this country, there were twice as many gay men than lesbian women. So there was, in fact, a straight sex ratio where there were more straight women than straight men by about 6%, or about 9 million. So when you look at these numbers, it's not a surprise that we also have demographically record numbers of single women heads of households that flow from this. It's very much the opposite of the Old West. So we cited that, we calculated that, and I think what I try to say is, look, just on the numbers, there are things that are happening in society just on the numbers that maybe we don't notice. A lot of this book is about understanding the future by doing a better job of understanding the present. And what I consistently find is that our economy is driven in such a way that it's usually driven by trends that are 10 or 15 years old. So, for example, women today are the majority of car buyers. They have been for some time. You could ask anybody in Detroit. They know that women are the majority of car buyers. Men are the majority of truck buyers. But they have a sales process, a showroom that was set up when men were 70% of the car buyers. And so have they changed it? Have they caught up with the times? They're not even close to catching up with the times because they're looking at trends 10 or 15 years back. Now, some of the other trends that we look at, which I think are interesting, is something as simple as internet marrieds. 10% of new marriages now met on the internet. Now, what are some of the implications of that? Well, first, what are people going to tell their kids when they're 5 or 6 how they met? Are they ready to say, hey, we met on the internet? Increasingly, they are. What does it mean in terms of class, race, and other barriers? Well, it used to be that marriage came from a fairly limited social set. But now, if it's increasingly coming through the internet, it tends to break down class, religion, and other barriers, and to replace them with choice-based with the choices that people make. And throughout the book, there's the theme that what used to be driven by class and race and other things is increasingly driven by choice. And internet marriage is a reflection of that. In many ways, it could lead to a considerable, almost revolution in the social structure if marriage doesn't come from a limited educational set, doesn't come from the church social, but really comes from an increasing widening pool represented on the internet. Now, some of the other areas we looked at, and I'll kind of go through some of the trends. We looked at the working retired, if you look at the work life. What we found now is that half the people are not going to retire at the age of retirement. Half of those because they want to, the other half because they need the money and therefore can't retire. But it's interesting that 25% of people are not retiring because they want to continue work, partly because they found work interesting and challenging. I often ask journalists, when are you going to retire? They all say never, right? And so if you're a young person saying, when is the boss going to retire? The answer may be when they carry him or her out, increasingly when you look at the numbers. And then, that old adage about, gosh, I would, the old deathbed story, I wish I had spent more time with my family. Well, when people have a choice, they seem to be choosing work. And when kids call their parents these days and say, come babysit, the answer is quite frequently, I'm busy. And it comes as quite a shock. So, we looked at some of the other things I find interesting. There's a group of people who are extreme commuters who commute each way more than 90 minutes and spend a lot of time in the car back and forth. They are the most sensitive to gas prices, but they're also reflective of how far people will go to get a decent plot of land, outside of where they work. So they're obviously buying property, where home values are less expensive in exchange for a long commute, and they are great customers, of course, for audiobooks and other do-it-yourself courses. But the opposite trends stay at home. I think the modern-day equivalent to the mom-and-pop shop is very much mom-and-pop consulting, and that a lot of family consulting businesses are springing up all over the place where people don't commute at all. And again, for every trend, there's a counter-trend. Now, the other thing that I discovered was the enormous growth of lefties. Now, by that I don't mean political lefties. There is a tremendous growth in southpaws. And, taking a look at something like that seems, insignificant in many ways, as we probe deeper, I theorize in the book that what used to happen, and there were almost no lefties if you go back 50 years ago, what used to happen is that parents would essentially say, oh my God, my child could be left-handed, they will be different, we can't have that. They essentially tie the hand behind their back and beat it out of them. And if you go back to Victorian times, there are almost no lefties. It appears from cave paintings that about 1 in 6 is the natural left-handedness of the population, and we are rapidly approaching the natural left-handedness within the population. And what does it say? It says that parents are taking a very different view. They're saying to their children, it's okay to be different. I don't mind. And that says a lot, not just about being left-handed, but how they treat other aspects of parenting. There are almost 2 million kids, for example, who are now vegan children, because when the kids say, I don't want to eat meat, the parents say, okay. And that has tremendous implications if parents are going to let kids be kids and develop to a much greater extent their individual talents and differences. And of course, that is going to create an even next generation of even more significant microtrends, because again, the driving force of individualism is quite significant. We had a lot of problems kind of looking at parental discipline, because we had a theory when we were doing the book that in fact parents who worked would probably be, harsher, more disciplinarian when they came home. And it turned out that actually when we surveyed parents, they said that they were in fact quite disciplinarian, but that all their neighbors were loosey-goosey. And this threw us in a quandary for a while, so we went back and asked them again, and it turned out that most parents decided that discipline was a good swift talk with their kids if they were found doing whatever wrongs they had done, and that they had changed the whole. They had really changed the whole framework of discipline, and that corporal punishment with kids is dramatically falling at a very fast and increasing rate. And by the way, should you try to discipline your children in public, you are likely to be arrested or could be arrested. I remember being on a plane recently where the father in front of me had some unruly kids. He threatened that if the kids continue to act up, he would take their ski trip away from them, and I thought he was going to be taken away by the stewardesses. So, in fact, attitudes towards discipline, public and private, are dramatically changing, but there are also some counter trends in parenting. Dads are actually spending more time with their kids than ever. The number of dads and the length of time they spend with the kids has gone up, and so right now we've spent so much time marketing to moms that in many ways now, as I point out in the book, dads are being somewhat neglected. There's a dramatic growth in older dads. Dads over 40, over 45 are skyrocketing. And again, as I point out in the book, there are a lot of trends here that have not crystallized, in the sense that no one's written a manual yet for the older dad. Nobody said how high school graduation when you're 70 and when you're 70 and your child's graduating 50 is going to become a regular occurrence that I think dads out there have almost no information on. So we're seeing a lot of changes. I love one of the chapters about parenting is what we call pet parents. And so what we found is that there was a 5 million household growth in the number of pets, and that what's happened is that people are delaying when they in fact get married and have a child. So what they're saying is, we don't have a child now, let's get a pet and try them out. And what happens is those are become very, very pampered pooches until the real child arrives, in which case they're somewhat neglected. On the other end of the spectrum, when more and more people live longer and become empty nesters, they're saying, our kids are gone, let's get a pet. And so on both ends of the spectrum, there's a dramatic growth in pets like this. And the old model of buying pets was when your child got 5, 6, 7, or 8, they demanded a pet. And eventually you gave in and the pet lived on table scraps or whatever, because the pet was in there with 1, 2, or 3, or 4 other children. Now the pet is a child substitute. So what happens is, and I think you can see this already in the pet marketplace, is that they become the subject of an enormous amount of disposable income, which is why we have pet bakeries, pet massages, pet spas. So we try to explain some of what you see going on. Now let me just cover 2 or 3 trends that I think are they're all serious in some sense because they represent people's choices, but 2 or 3 trends I think that are worth noting. One is what I call the impressionable elites. An interesting finding that the people who are higher in income, higher in education, turn out to be much more interested in personality in politics, and people lower in education, lower in income, tend to be much more interested in the issues. And that working classes now have A, much more education generally, B, have access to the internet, C, have issues that vitally impact and affect their lives. And so when they talk about health care or bringing someone home from Iraq, they're talking about their own family. The impressionable elites that are much more focused on personality generally are at a much higher standard of living and are not living through the same kinds of issues. So I think that's an interesting trend. I kind of say I could probably maybe turn that trend into an entire book someday, because I think it's becoming more and more evident. Some other things I think that are unnoticed that are quite serious is the dramatic growth in college dropouts. What's happened is we spend so much time on solving the high school dropout problem, which we haven't solved, but we've dramatically reduced the number of high school dropouts. But at the same time, we've dramatically increased the number of college dropouts. But as I said before, with trends, we don't often catch up to the new trend. So there's no, while there's a $5 billion industry to prepare people for college, there is not an analogous industry now to deal with people that don't make it through college, often because they have work-life issues that don't enable them to finish college. Same thing, I think, in terms of number of people getting out of prison. We went through a number of years where the number of people going into prison dramatically increased. And now the number of people getting out of prison has tripled from 200,000 to 650,000 a year, and yet we haven't seen the kind of tripling of programs and reintegration into society. So I think there are a lot of microtrends socially that require the kind of attention that I don't think we're giving them, because I don't think that they have yet been noticed, even though they can have tremendous impact on how we live. Finally, I think I kind of wrap up the book about educated terrorists, and in that chapter we note that quite contrary to what a lot of people say in terms of who terrorists are, most of the studies that are done say that many of the terrorists are in fact well educated, slightly more likely to be engineers for reasons that I have no idea, but it also goes to the point that many times people who are poorer and less educated are too smart to blow themselves up in a public square, and that it takes somebody really well educated to do that and to believe in a philosophy of destroying yourself along with others. And so that of course is not a microtrend, it's a nanotrend. If it ever became a microtrend, of course society as we know it would be over. Finally, the book says, look, you have to step back and understand that there's nothing wrong with being made up of a number of atoms. As Democritus discovered, even something as simple as this book would be made up of billions of atoms. They still come together holistically, but if you change ever so slightly the composition of atoms, you change tremendously the way society works and how it functions. I think that at the end of the day, what we're seeing is the explosion of microtrends, the explosion of individuality, I think is now being met with, I think, a more commonality of values of fairness and tolerance. You can't have a society where so many people are living so many different and so many more accepted lifestyles unless society is becoming more tolerant. That many of the Republican social wars in the past actually didn't unify society, they divided society in ways, and now you've seen a 10 or 15 point shift in many of these issues that I think is bringing people together more. And so quite the opposite than what people, I think, at first blush try to look at the theory of microtrends. In many ways, if you have a society that tolerates and understands that people can be different in so many ways, you have a society that is more cohesive, better able to continue to be democratic, and better able to move forward. So that's an introduction of the book, and Nancy, I'm happy to kind of take questions. Thank you guys very much.
Passing around a microphone. If you don't mind just standing up.
do you agree with me that from the very beginning of the campaign, the media, you'll like the question, the media embraced the candidacy of Obama, treating him as if he was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who would solve all our national and international ills because of their goal, of their ultimate goal to destroy the candidacy of Hillary Clinton because of the hatred that the media feels for the Clintons.
Well, I'd just like to say that's not in the book.
But that's the way I feel, and I was wondering if
No,
you
I appreciate it. I'm going to stick to the book tonight. I appreciate the question, but I'm not going to kind of wade into questions about the media. I want to kind of stick a little bit to the book. Thank you very much.
Hi. Two questions. The first, is this on? I'm probably louder without it.
Hold on, please.
Sure. Oh, sorry. So my first question is most of the data that you gathered primary research, or did you use other sources?
Well, I'd say about 90% of the data is secondary, or somebody else's primary research.
Right.
What we did was we gathered a combination of polls and statistics. Sometimes we did our own polls because we were interested in some of the things on parenting and other issues where we kind of probed more deeply. But a lot of the point of microtrends is that you could be a microtrender. You could, the information is out there. People often ask me, well, how did you, how do you find microtrends? And I say, look, oftentimes it starts with a theory or a hypothesis about how people are changing. Right. I mean, something like I didn't go through the upscale tattooed, but there's a dramatic growth. We're up to 30 million people with tattoos. It's even beyond a microtrend. So there are a lot of things where you start with a theory. Does that seem to have spread to a more upper class, something that started at lower class, and then you begin to look at the statistics, gather information, and then either that proves out or not.
Okay. And then my second question is, I could see how, the micro trends are really valuable and useful in, creating political campaigns as well as, marketing, promotions and stuff like that. But could you give me an example of how a micro trend played out in maybe like a more traditional public relations role? Like, have you done any kind of communication that...
Well, first I just sort of say, in terms of politics, politics is often about the big goals, and I always explain, Senator Clinton really talks about 4 big goals, and this is, you see a lot of marketing that I think is finely targeted, because if you have a 1% product, for example, you have a success. I mean, I've been quite interested in, one of the things we found was this dramatic growth of teenage knitters, right? And so I found that if you go back to the teenage knitting sites, of which there turn out to be plenty, they almost all refer to microtrends, because we've crystallized something that's counterintuitive, that's different, and then promotes itself. So when you say in public relations, people are doing different things. If something like teenage knitters gets attention, in a way that it hasn't gotten attention, and it's counterintuitive, and people go out and say, there's so much talk about technology and cell phones. There's a whole group of teenagers here that want to make something with their hands, and then that gets, people really tune into that, and then it grows even bigger.
Do you still think that the early adopter idea is true? I mean, does a small group adopt the trend and then it kind of filters downwards, or does it come from the bottom up?
Well, I think the early adopters are having less importance, I think, because we talk about, in terms of technology, where the early adopter model was always the biggest. It's interesting that the person who uses technology today is the most sociable person. So in the past, the early adopter technology, the classic view of the geek, was somebody that didn't, leave the library, leave his house. Now, technology is so much about communication, right, that really high school students are likely to be the spreaders of a new technology, of a sidekick, of something like that, far more so than the traditional model, because they're interested in what technology does today, which is connects people and brings them together.
I would assume that the book is mostly based on US data, but did you collect any data from other countries on the same developmental status as the United States, where you found like similar trends? Another question, are there any theories, like, I mean, real systematic theories or micro trends beyond like theories on individualization?
Well, the question was, is there a lot of international trends? The book is probably about 85% about the United States, but we have 10 trends that are international to show how it applies in different countries, and we update some of the things going on in the countries. You know, I was kind of stunned, you know, very interestingly in Europe, precisely in the places where the tax incentives and advantages of having children were the highest, birth rates were the lowest. And so a lot of what we do in microtrends is we look for things that are counterintuitive, because I don't really spend a lot of time on things everybody knows. I either spend a lot of time on things that I think people probably know but they're not really acting on, or things they don't know, which I was really surprised at really what we found in some of the European places. And it's interesting, in the Conservative Party conference, they read the book and they used it in Great Britain. We picked at those people who are living together apart, because there's this enormous growth of households, and there are a lot of people in the UK who, in fact, even though they were going together steady, they were not, in fact, you know, putting their households together, and that created a whole series of new issues. We found that the birth rates were so low in some of the European countries that being an only child was becoming a commonplace experience, and so what we call Eurostars, you know, the pampered children, has become, you know, a dramatically different experience. And then we looked in places like Vietnam and China for counterintuitive trends, where we found Chinese Picassos or Vietnamese entrepreneurs. So the idea is, I think that microtrends, these smaller 1% differences that I think can have a real impact on what society is like, you see them everywhere, that there are various freedoms of different kinds, and they develop differently, and they develop counterintuitively. So, and I don't know about that much, you know, I think there are some books, the long tail, there are books on differentiation, but what we try to do in the book is to illustrate, you know, microtrends not just in theory, but really in practice.
I was actually really intrigued by your comment about the lefties, about how it was actually kind of indicative of, you know, this change in parenting attitudes. And what I thought was interesting was because it actually indicated a macro trend. It was sort of a micro trend that elucidated something that was much greater, you know, which was a trend in parenting for many more millions of parents. I'm just curious if your analysis is kind of, you know, if you take a different spin on this, you could actually make it much bigger and so forth, more profound. And if that's kind of what you've been trying to do, or do you try to do that a lot, or is a lot of it just sort of niche?
I'm definitely not against that. No, I think that in fact I do think that that was a small symbol of something that I think was really much bigger, and that was the point of the chapter. And some people like to dispute the chapter. Again, you know, the luxury of writing a book is that you can come to a conclusion that you have, you know, about the data, and you know, and you can speculate about what you think it means in a larger context. And I think that I do think, when I put together, you know, things like vegan children, things like the growth of lefties, things that all indicate, and things like what we found in parental discipline, they all indicate this larger, as you say, larger trend that parents are taking a very different attitude towards their children. And so, yeah, you know, if some researcher would put together a list of countries that start with the largest number of percentage of left-handed people down to the smallest, it frankly I think would be an interesting, you know, an interesting list that would maybe prove the point, but I haven't done that yet.
Hi, I was interested in your comment that you could write a book about impressionable elites, and a lot of us who studied the polls know that Obama has attracted a lot of the higher income groups. Rather than go into the whole Obama thing, because Obama strikes me as a macro trend, not a micro trend, could you give us a couple of other examples in campaigns or marketing or whatever, where the impressionable elites have been impressionable in particular instances?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And when I say I could write a book, it's not just in the political context. I think that there are a lot of contexts. I think that a lot of of brand marketing is really based on what I call exaggerating a reality gap, a gap between kind of known facts and, you know, an image that's created. I think the surprising thing in the book, and I have to do more research, is the extent to which I think people will echo, you know, cable TV talking points and things without really understanding the full underlying information. And so I think you're seeing an increased trend of people making making decisions on the basis of hearsay and very limited information. The surprising thing is that the model used to be very much that was likely happening downscale. And what the surprise is that it's happening with busy, well-educated people upscale, and that people who are, you know, working class people are just so much more plugged in to the reality of things. You know, I think that, you know, it's interesting too, you know, I always say for every trend there's a counter trend. I think there's a lot more information-based shopping. You know, that people now, if you could talk to somebody in the car industry, the typical car buyer, again, the typical car buyer for whom money matters, the car matters, is not just showing up in the showroom anymore. They're going through a pretty extensive information search on the internet first. So I think that there are two trends here. Some people in various areas being much more impression-based, and some people actually being so much more information-based than they ever were.
Do you have a couple of other examples with candidates? That's what I was.
Yeah, I just, you know, stay away from.
Fair enough.
I'll stick to the book tonight. Thank you.
I was wondering, do you think that there are more micro trends now than there used to be? I.e., are people more diverse than they used to be, or are those micro trends just more visible, or are there more opportunities for divergence, or is there just more possibility for those micro trends to be well publicized?
No, I think that there are more microtrends because of the three developments that I suggested at the beginning, that in fact the internet makes it, you know, you could find 100,000 people that, you know, eat deep fried yak, I mean, through the internet and put it together. So it enables you to, I think, draw people together. Second, economically, the ability for companies to produce more customized products. And third, I believe that there is a greater drive towards being more individualistic. I think you see that in something like the upscale. The upscale tattooed is a very good example, I think, of people wanting more self-expression. You know, and so what I try to do in the book is say, oh, well, something as simple as that. Nobody's done an upscale tattoo parlor yet, or maybe one or two are now appearing. There are all these work rules that you can't have it visible. So these trends, I think, are overcoming the norm in a lot of ways and indicating a greater self-expression. So I think there are economic reasons why there are more microtrends, and there are personal reasons why I think there are more microtrends. And I think, you know, again, if you go back to the Ford example, the view of mass society was that everything was going to be similar. That I'd walk into here, you'd all have the, you know, it would be too expensive to clothe everybody, you'd all wear the same clothes, you'd all be the same color, and that just is turning out to be false more or less everywhere when economic development, you know, really I think gets going. And I think that's a big shock. Now, we may be the most micro-trended country. I don't have a full cross-sectional analysis, but certainly the trends that you see in societies are not towards what people expected mass society to be. It's quite the opposite.
Hi. So I would think with microtrends you have a very large problem of sample size, right? You get very small samples and they may be trends, they may not be. My real question is, how much is just pointing out that these microtrends exist what creates the trend in the first place? Like, I would think simply saying this is a microtrend is what starts pushing it towards becoming a trend. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, I don't know about self-fulfilling, but when a trend is crystallized, it's quite different because it tends to bring people together in a way that, you know, again, if you're a teenage knitter and you're just sitting there, but if you learn that there are now 2 million teenage knitters, you say, wow, okay, there's a whole group of people making the same kind of choice that I am, and that that is different. And then what happens is the companies start to say, teenage knitters, maybe we should start to make teenage knitter practice. Somebody, clips out an article and puts it on the CEO desk. We're behind here in this. So you're exactly right and many of the trends in this book will, frankly, they won't crystallize. They won't turn out to be, particularly important, but many of them I think will be or will get crystallized. And once they get, once people understand that they're part of a community that's made certain choices, I think that it then tends to give people if you take something like the older dads, I think the older dads phenomenon out there has not been crystallized in any meaningful way, and that, if I had time for another book and wasn't quite tied up, that would be a great book, because it would crystallize, I think, a whole generation of people, in the way that soccer moms, I think, also crystallized a generation.
This is a question from an older dad, right? But it's about numbers. In your book, I may have got this wrong, but you suggest a micro-trend of people being much more interested in numbers. Now, I think that may well be true, but it seems to me a conflict with values. Take, for instance, television. The dumbing down of television is the obsession with morons between the ages of 17 and 40, right? Same in the movies. Same in the book business, generally. So have we not got here a kind of conflict between what you think is a beneficial market trend, i.e. interest in numbers, and the tyranny of the mass over quality?
Well, I think, see, this is precisely the heart of the book, because the heart of the book is, well, for every trend there's a counter trend, and so what I try to do is find the book is point out the counter trend. So we know the trend that you're pointing out, but I don't think people realize, well, there's a show called Numbers. It's all about somebody who kind of uses numbers as a detective. There's unlimited, interest in polls and numbers. Now, I think people interested in numbers are not particularly interested in arithmetic, okay? Those are two very different things, okay? But they are very interested in seeing, numbers, how they impact. Now, it's not everybody, Again, in the book, I have something that I don't think people have identified, what I call the long attention spanners, okay? So everybody has already identified the ADD people, okay? Everybody knows them. But there's another group of people who fill the internet. I mean, there's a reason that the internet sites are 50 pages deep. It's for the LASers, the long attention spanners. They eat up information like there's no tomorrow. And they keep going, and they stay up late at night. And if you were going to analyze, the prime internet customer is not the ADD person, it's the long attention spanner, right? And so that's my whole point, exactly, that for the groups out there are these other groups out there who are probably underserved, under-recognized, right, in many different ways.
Can you talk a little bit about your polling techniques? When do you decide to use focus groups, or do you ever call people on their cell phones? Or how long do you have questionnaires? Are there any techniques that you found valuable?
Yeah, I'm less a believer in focus groups than I am quantitative information, because focus groups have a group dynamic that oftentimes doesn't reflect their individual choices, particularly when a focus group will tend to represent people going along with the group, whereas a lot of what we're looking at is people not going along with the group and making their own choice. Eventually people will be polled on cell phones. I mean, there have been a lot of reasons why we couldn't poll people on cell phones. They're usually on the go. It's usually not really allowed. It might cost people money. So I don't think actually we'll wind up polling through cell phones. We'll wind up polling much more on the internet. And just as when I started, all polling was door to door, then phone gradually became acceptable. Now the internet is semi-acceptable. It doesn't really have, even though the penetration is so quickly growing, it doesn't really have the full spectrum of voter groups yet. But another decade, I think there will be no phone polling, and it will move pretty much to the internet, in which people on the internet, again, those LASers fill out a lot of surveys and provide in-depth open-endeds that are considerable. So we have maybe I don't know how much time you've got, but
I'm also fascinated by what you have to say about impressionable elites and the way you phrase it. they live through their problems more so, working class people live through their problems more than impressionable elites. So my question is, do you count Congress among impressionable elites? And then what are the implications of impressionable elites for actual policy, from the war in Iraq to education, so on and so on?
Well, you know, hopefully your congressman is in tune with the constituents and really has their ear. I know that Nancy's husband sure is. So I think, you know, look, part of the job of somebody in Congress is to continually stay in touch with what is happening with the broad mass of voters. But I think that it is an issue generally, you know, in the Beltway, in Washington, that, you know, and with that so many opinions can become the same because they've overheard things, they've read the same article, you know, and suddenly opinion shifts because of one or two key articles that they see, as opposed to kind of this more individual inquiry. As I said, representative democracy was originally set up under the notion that the most considered people would be those with the highest education. And so it fundamentally is at odds if, in fact, the most considered people are not necessarily those with the highest education. And so, look, I think the individual public servants and people in Congress I've met are great, and they are far more policy and detail-oriented than I think people ever give them credit for in terms of the complexity of the job that they do. You know, having said that, there is a there is a chattering class out there that very often, you know, is influenced very quickly by what they see or read without really understanding the underlying facts. But remember, you know, for many years everybody thought the world was flat. So misperception is nothing new to the human race.
Thanks very much. In South Africa, we've got a big megatrend of people being HIV positive. And we're looking for solutions. We've come here for 2 months to look at different prevention models in America. Do you have any suggestions what we can start looking for from your point of view, and any ideas of how we can take them back and implement them?
And what's the answer?
So what
was the last part of the question?
I was looking for any sort of trends that you would suggest looking for so we can come up with some implementable solutions.
It's not something I could say is in my area of expertise. I think Senator Clinton has some excellent policies, however, but I don't think that I would say that I could really give you a meaningful answer, because it's not something that I really spent a lot of time studying.
Yes, I just want to say that I live in Brooklyn, and there are a lot of dog pens or whatever in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn there's few there, and there are more children in the monkey bars and everything. But my thing is this. My question, immigration. And I see a lot that they seem to be like a herd instinct. They got the language, the food, the same church. We have Ukrainian Catholic, Armenian Catholic, you know, Polish, and we also got the Hispanics in their own different groups. We also got the Muslims there, and I see that, you know, there's a much, you know, this is almost like a counter. Us Europeans are, as you said, a low birth rate, and we need immigrants to workers, and we're getting more immigrants. And they tell me that we may be a minority here in Manhattan in the 5 boroughs at some point, and I see, they tell me this is happening in, how shall I say, Europe and Japan and a few other places. Thank you. I don't know. I mean, what I'm saying.
Again,
is
I'm not making any comment on you know, on immigration. I think the point of the book is that we live in an increasingly diverse society that is accepting of diversity, you know, throughout society.
Maybe 2 more questions.
Sure.
From listening to you, it seems like we're entering a different paradigm with the democratization of communications technology, communications media. Mm-hmm. Virtually anyone can be a broadcast source. So in Madison Avenue, it used to be how to cut through the clutter, how to get your message past all the noise through the clutter. today, since virtually any one of us can be our own source of broadcast with the technology available today, it seems like clutter is the way. And so the idea, the paradigm of a control mechanism top-down is no longer relevant. It's more like chaos. Chaos theory might have more relevance today. Your ideas or thoughts about that?
Well, look, obviously there's a dramatic increase in the diversity of media and of opinions. The question is are there in fact many more opinions, or some of the trends of impressionable elites, I think in fact give you relatively few opinions, in a spectrum. I don't think that has fully sorted itself out. I think that, again, as I pointed out at the beginning, a trend like a YouTuber, a trend like an individual broadcaster, I think trends like the bloggers, they're here to stay. The majority of people in this room are not going to become, bloggers or YouTubers, but they are classic microtrends in the sense that they have impact, they're different, they're drawn together by kind of the intense choices and lifestyle that they lead. And so you're right. Look, diversity of media continues. There's dramatic change in the media, but oftentimes we still see the big stories that appear on A1, that appear in the nightly news. They tend to drive a tremendous amount right through the media. So we in many ways still live, I think, in a world where the big media broadcast the big story, and there are obvious upsets where the blogs will find something contradictory to that and change the story. But in a typical day, I think the story is still being driven very much by the big media.
Thank you for your presentation and the book. My question is, of the thousands of microtrends there are, what kind of criteria or methodology you use to select these particular 70s?
Well, I think what we've tried to do was we said, look, let's take 15 different areas of life and illustrate 5 or 6, because the truth is there aren't just 75 microtrends, there are 7,500, 10,000. There are almost an unlimited number of trends that it could be found in a society that is changing, I think, in so many ways as ours. But we tried to say, look, you want a microtrend if you aren't increasing, and typically increasing fairly dramatically. You weren't a microtrend unless you were going to hit 1% or above, and sometimes, depending upon it, we were some a little below and some are several percent. But we had basic criteria that we applied: the dramatic increase, the hit the threshold of 1%, and then to illustrate in different areas, what are some of the counterintuitive microtrends that are developing, and then say, hey, you might be, somebody who works in a fashion industry or computer industry, and begin to look around and stop treating, consumers like they're all the same when they've changed in so many different ways. I think that's the message of the book. It's meant to illustrate rather than to be a real encyclopedia.
Okay, one more question. I can do that because I own the bookstore. But have you noticed any trends with in the future of bookstores or reading? How does the future look?
Well, I think we had a couple of things. We didn't do, as many on books because my publisher said that might be bad for like who would carry it. But again, I don't think, I don't think people are focusing on who the LASers are. I mean, when you think about who's going to be the customer, right, for books, over time, it is the LASers. And I don't think we've done a good job. I think you ought to identify who they are. You ought to have little pins. People ought to say, hey, I'm patient. I read stuff. I like information. Okay, you ought to be proud, to be an LASer. And so I think that's the kind of thing, if bookstores would pick up, on that and make people feel really good about that, I think that would be one of my recommendations.
Great audience. Thank you for such a engaging discussion. Thank you, Mark Penn.
Thank you.
And thank you, C-SPAN, for its commitment to unembellished broadcasting. And Mark's going to stick around, answer more questions, and sign lots of copies of his books.
Book about trends in America. It doesn't have any campaign secrets. When people try to kind of read into it one thing or another, the truth of the matter is it is a book about how the country's changing and how you see some of the trends that are quite important to those changes. You know, the theory of the book is that the era of big trends is over, and that, you know, we're now in an era of what I call micro trends. And it's not to say that, in fact, the era of big movements is over, or big changes are over, or that big things that happen are over. All of those things, I think, are quite strong. In fact, the book, as I come back to, ends, I think, quite optimistically about how it seems to me that we're coming together around a common set of values, even though we are, in many ways, so much more individualistic. And I think that what we're finding is that there are a tremendous number of 1% trends that are driving society, that small groups are in fact becoming pivotally important. I think even if you look in the presidential campaign, a group like YouTubers, for example, is never going to be a large group, but it played an influential role in one of the key presidential debates. It plays an influential role in a lot of the changes in society. And so what personalization to the music, so that you could actually walk around with something that was infinitely personalized, even though it was commonly manufactured. And that is very much the key to how the economy is changing, in that people want things to be infinitely personalized. I think that it's quite interesting. I think in addition to that, there's an individualistic streak. You know, people today don't wear the same color clothes. They don't want to look alike. As you go back to the 50s, if your neighbor had a house with a white picket fence, you would say, we want a white picket fence. Today, I think if your neighbor has a white picket fence, you probably turn around and say, let's have a purple fence. People actually have become more individualistic. And so I think what's happened is the changes with the internet, the changes with the economy and what could be produced, along with, I think, a more individualistic streak, is really producing micro trends, which are producing some very interesting and almost contradictory things. I think there's while on the other hand the economy in many ways is struggling, there certainly is considerably more affluence. And yet people, as we talk about in the book, want to work more and more even when they are affluent. You're having the sense that there's a tremendous trend towards health, and yet at the same time people are heavier and more obese than ever. People are drinking water at a faster and
he's also been advisor to many, including our own Mayor Bloomberg and Bill Gates, and he's now the author of the recent book, Micro Trends, the Small Forces Beyond Tomorrow's Big Changes. As much as everybody probably only wants to speak about presidential politics, we've asked Mark to discuss micro trends tonight. He writes about how small numbers of people drive business markets or other cultural, social, and political developments. He identifies 75 micro trends that can transform a business, tie an election, spark a movement, or change your life. As usual, after Mark's done, there'll be plenty of times to open up this mic to any of your questions. So tonight, let's have Clinton and Obama supporters and everyone else shout a big welcome for Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate your having me here tonight. I know we set this up a few months ago, and I was determined to take an hour off, and which I haven't done for a while, and talk about the book. For those of you who were expecting a political book, it's not a political book. It's really what we're seeing with these micro trends is that they don't have to become big to become important, to become integrated into our culture. You know, we seem to be, you know, as I look at it, there were 2 or 3 things going on. First, obviously, you know, the internet has made it so much easier to reach so many more people in so many different ways, and to bring together communities, you know, across their geography. I think that's pretty straightforward. I think second is that the economy itself has changed from what I call a Ford economy to a Starbucks economy. In the Ford economy, You could have, as you may recall, as they said about the Model T, you could have any color you want as long as it's black. And today at Starbucks, it's mocha, frappuccino, decaf, semi, grande 180. There are actually 155 separate choices because the economy has changed from the idea of mass production being uniform production to the idea that in fact we can give people the kind of choices in their lives that mean something to them, even on something as small as coffee. I always say the iPod is an example of a cross between the Ford economy and the Starbucks economy, because for a long time it was any color you want as long as it was white. And what it did was it drove the person.
Good evening, everyone. We're at the height of an exciting campaign season, and at the Strand, we want to make some news this evening with a ringing endorsement. We continue to support important and compelling books. I'm Nancy Bass-Wyden. I'm the third generation of Strand owners, along with my dad, who's in the back. It's Fred Bass. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded by my grandfather in 1927 in an area that was located around the corner that's no longer in existence. It was called Book Row. And after 80 years, we just want to thank our customers for the support. Along with my husband, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, I'm a loyal Democrat. Both of us think Senator Clinton and Senator Obama would make an excellent president who would get America back on track. So we're neutral in the Democratic primary for president. But here at the Strand, we aren't neutral about exceptional books and creative people, and tonight in Mark Penn, we have both. Mark is one of the most influential political experts in the United States. He's the premier strategist for Senator Clinton's presidential run, the CEO of the worldwide public relations firm Burson Marsteller,